Hello, welcome to my channel, and today we're doing a review of The Invisible Life of Addie Larue. So, The Invisible Life of Addie Larue is a story that follows the titular character. Addie Larue is a young French lady who is raised in the 18th century in France, and she makes a Faustian bargain. She essentially sells her soul to a devil, and she is cursed with both immortality, but also the fact that no one will ever remember her. She cannot make a mark on history. So this means that when people talk to her, it'll be like they've met her for the first time. If they turn away for too long, if they don't look at her for a certain period of time, they look at her again and she's gone. She's gone from their memory, and it's like meeting her for the first time all over again. I would start off by saying that this book, the premise I thought was incredibly interesting. Before I started reading it, I thought this is an interesting premise. I wonder how V.E Schwab is going to be able to execute on it. Then when I read the first quarter or so of this book, I was really enraptured with it. The first 25% or so really hooked me, drew me in. I got to meet Addie and follow her through the start of this book, and I was super engrossed. It caught me right away, and I thought this is going to be a new favourite book of mine. It's going to be one that I absolutely love, and is going to be a 5-star read. I was really thinking that was where this was going. So we essentially have 2 points of view. The first is modern day New York with Addie set in 2014, whereas the other timeline we have is from the 17th century France, when we see Addie before she makes this bargain and the aftermath of that, as it follows on from when that happens, and we get snippets all the way through. So both these timelines do work sort of sequentially, but obviously one is set long before the other. So to start with, this story of her in the past is where we get a lot of our plot at the beginning of the story, whereas the present day is where we get a lot of our character work. Really, we do get some character work in the flashbacks as well, but yeah, we very much get this sort of double whammy of plot and character from the flashbacks, and then a real understanding of what this has looked like for her 300 years later, how her life is now. And I think the real strength of this book is the character of Addie Larue. Addie is a very interesting character. She is very likeable as well, and that is a real draw. This is what really hooked me initially, is that she is both interesting and likeable, both in the flashbacks and in the present day. And I think that was a big selling point for this book as we got started. I think she's incredibly well drawn and incredibly well realised as a person, and I would say as well, I think the curse is incredibly well realised as well. It is one of the better realised curses that I've read in fiction. I think Schwab does an incredibly good job of thinking through how that would actually work, what that would actually mean in day-to-day life, and how that would affect Addie as a person as well. And I think that, along with Addie's character, is a massive draw for the start of this book. Unfortunately, as this book continued, it didn't quite progress as I hoped it would. So I started thinking this was going to be an easy 5-star read. Unfortunately, it didn't quite meet those expectations for me. So in the middle, again, this is a non-spoiler review. I'm not going to give you any specific spoilers, but I will say that in the middle of the book, it does start to meander. And I know this happens in a lot of books. The middle section is where it slows down, but this was particularly because we get introduced to another character who becomes quite a big part of it. As we are introduced to this character, we get a huge chunk of their backstory. And for me, this really slowed the book down as we struggle to accommodate this new character into the story we've been being told. At the same time, Addie's flashback chapters also slow down, and that's partly because we're seeing how she immediately deals with the curse, but it does feel quite repetitive at times, and I understand why Schwab has decided to do that, but I feel like actually we did it a little bit too much. And the repetition is a device that really helps us understand how this curse makes Addie feel, and that's great, but I think maybe we overdid it slightly in this section of the book. The other main characters we get introduced to create issues other than just pacing as well. So actually in this book, I loved Addie, I loved her character. Unfortunately, the side characters don't get my heart in the same way. They are not as interesting. They're a little bit more mundane and a little bit more, they're less well realised and a little bit more bland, to be honest. And unfortunately, that means that they don't pack the same punch that we get when we follow Addie. And yeah, really it is her that is pulling us through, or at least pulled me through the story, far more than these other characters we get to meet and we get to engage with. One in particular did feel particularly predictable. I don't know whether some of the reveals to do with this character were meant to be big, groundbreaking reveals, that were meant to shock us, but they certainly didn't. They more felt like, yeah, that's what I thought was happening. And unfortunately, that means that it feels like it's written in such a way that it is trying to be a big gut punch, like a big surprise twist. And it never really felt like a surprise. It felt like the foreshadowing for that was maybe more heavy-handed than was needed or was intended to be. Thankfully, towards the end of this book, it does improve. V.E Schwab definitely sticks the landing here. I think the ending is not quite as strong as the beginning, but is a much of an improvement over the middle of this book. There is one other thing that really made me start questioning my love for this book as we continued. And I know this isn't going to be a big deal for most people, but there is definitely something to do with the way the magic worked that felt for me rather inconsistent. And I know we're dealing with bargains and we're dealing with devils, and it is very much a soft magic system. So I'm not trying to impose a bunch of rules on this that it doesn't need to have in our story here. It is clearly a soft magic system, and that's fine. However, I still want some consistency, and it did feel like there was one way which this curse worked that, if I'm being kind, was a bit of a plot convenience. If I'm feeling less generous, it was a pretty big plot hole. I've not really seen many other people discuss it, so maybe there is a reason for that I have missed, or maybe it's just something that most people aren't going to spot. Either way, it didn't impact my enjoyment too much, but it did just lessen it a little bit. I think most people might not notice it. I think a lot of people, even if they do notice it, won't be bothered by it at all, can hand wave it away, and that's fine. But if plot conveniences or plot holes, especially to do with magic systems, bother you, this might cause you a bit of an issue. Now, considering a lot of the negatives, a lot of the critique I've just given to this book, you might be forgiven for thinking that I didn't really like it. However, the character of Addie Larue and the characterization of her, the relationships she has or doesn't have in many cases, as people forget her, it is just written really wonderfully well. There is something about it that is very attractive. There's something about it that is really appealing. And actually the fact that the landing was stuck and I enjoyed the ending of this book, even if it was somewhat predictable, it was still written really well and I still enjoyed it. And actually that in lots of ways is such a big part of how I think about this book, is the enjoyment of the character and the enjoyment of the curse and how it was realised, that actually it overshadows a lot of those negative points I had about it. So for you, those negatives might be too big. It might mean that you really don't enjoy this book. But for me, it still came in as a 4-star read for me. It was enjoyable, but it did have some issues, and that would be how I describe this book to people. I would definitely be a recommend if it sounds interesting to you, but it is not without its flaws, as is true of all books, I suppose. Do give this video a like, do subscribe to me if you enjoyed it, and I will see you again soon.